Welcome to Real Solutions. This is the podcast series on policies for a future where everyone belongs. We're from the Othering and Belonging Institute and hosting this podcast series with leaders from across the country to uplift and insist on bold policy solutions that would move the country towards belonging and well-being for all people.
Today, we're talking about community crisis response programs. Police were made the one-size-fits-all response to social problems in the U.S., driving a racist system of mass incarceration. To create an alternative, over 100 communities across the country have launched community crisis response programs that provide emergency public services, responding to 911 calls by sending a community health worker, emergency medical technician, or other non-police professional. This provides people in crisis with a healing-focused response, such as de-escalation, mental and physical health support, and connections to services. Ultimately, these services promise to reduce police violence and rates of incarceration and improve community health and stability.
So today we talk with someone who's been working on the community level in the oldest crisis response service in the country, in Eugene, Oregon. Michelle Perin spent 27 years working in community safety, with experience in traditional public safety roles like a 911 dispatcher, firefighter, EMT, and behavioral health, and then began with the Community Crisis Response Service CAHOOTS in 2016. She worked on the van as a clinical supervisor and coordinator and provided community training, especially to law enforcement and EMS partners.
We're also talking with a national expert on community crisis response programs who has a pulse on the range of programs around the country. Tahir Duckett is the executive director of Georgetown Law Center for Innovations in Community Safety and an adjunct professor at the law school. His scholarship focuses on community safety infrastructure, including violence prevention and crisis response. He is a member of the Nonpartisan Council on Criminal Justice and sits on the board of directors of the Alternative Mobile Services Association. He was a founding executive committee member of Law for Black Lives, DC, an organization providing legal and policy support to the movement for Black lives in the Washington, DC metropolitan area.
Enjoy the episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Real Solutions, a podcast on policies for a future where everyone belongs. My name is Jose Richard Aviles with the Othering and Belonging Institute, and I'm super excited for this episode in particular because it's personal. Someone who sits at the intersections of urban planning and social work, community crisis response is always at the forefront of what I like to do. But before we get started, I'm going to pass it over to Eli, who's going to do a little bit of an intro description to this episode, and we'll get started.
We're going to talk about community crisis response programs today, and I have a personal passion for this because my mom and my godmother, Deborah Moore and Consuelo Vasquez, in the 1970s were part of one of the early expressions of community crisis response programs in Eugene, Oregon, where they were part of what they called the Bummer Squad, which was a crew of community members who would respond if somebody was having some kind of drug-related crisis or other crisis and needed support but didn't need the police. And I think it's beautiful to think about those community-driven solutions that will find their moment in history, where now there are over 100 cities around the country that are implementing community crisis response programs. And so you never know when some of these small local efforts will turn into a much larger solution. So excited to talk with two people who have been deeply involved in the work, both in Oregon and across the country, about what this solution is, how it works, and what the promise is. So thank you, Michelle and Tahir, for joining us.
Let's, set some ground setting. And we know that crises happen all the time in people's lives. In some ways, especially not more than ever, it feels like crises are just, we've normalized them. And so when it comes to community crisis programs, what are those common crises that folks are talking about or are responding to?
A crisis can happen to anybody because a crisis is when somebody has reached the end of their rope. It's when they have reached the capacity for them to be able to function in that situation. So it's really hard to say it's only a mental health crisis, or it's only a housing crisis, or it's only a substance use crisis, because it can happen to anybody. Like, it's like all of us know that we can think back into our history and go, okay, there was a time when I became overwhelmed and did not feel like I could function to capacity anymore. And that is what a crisis is when you're at that point where you're just unable to continue to function. Your coping skills are not working anymore. It's just, you've reached your kind of max. Like, there's no more room for anything to come in. And unless somebody helps kind of come scoop some of that stuff out, then you're not going to be able to function normally, or socially appropriately, or in so many different ways. So community responder teams are able to go assess kind of what brought that person to the top of their capacity, and start offering some of that scooping out so that they can refunction again.
One of the things we like to think about in this series is what's a North Star for the future that we all want to sort of move towards. No one policy can get us there, but we want to think about what's the society that we're trying to create and organize ourselves towards. And so I'm curious, when we think about community crisis and that ideal future, what's an ideal way to respond to a community crisis? Tahir?
One of the things that Michelle just pointed out is that there are all different kinds of sources of crisis, right? And some of which may be overlapping with one another at any given point. And I think one of the problems with our current system is that we respond to a whole bunch of different kinds of crises with one sort of tool that we have available in most cities 24/7, that can be reached at any time by anybody who's got access to a phone, right? You call 911. Somebody's in a crisis, right? A family member, somebody that you're walking by on the street is in crisis, and you call 911. And because cities have invested in sufficient numbers of police officers to be able to be anywhere, anytime, then that's who we send, right? Something I love that Barry Friedman from NYU's policing project says is that a lot of times folks aren't calling the police, they're calling 911, and we are sending the police. And so when you think about the kinds of crises that folks might be having, maybe it's a mental health crisis, maybe it's substance use, maybe it's something related to poverty, maybe it's a conflict, maybe it's a familial conflict. Who are we sending is really a key question, because when you send law enforcement, the one thing that all law enforcement have is they've got the power to take your freedom and the power to take your life. And that brings something into a space, right? When people are in these really, really vulnerable moments and law enforcement show up, even the most well-trained, even the most patient, empathetic law enforcement are showing up with handcuffs and a gun. And so that means that is part of the solution, the potential solution that's on offer in that moment. And that has really bad downstream consequences, I think, for a lot of these types of crises, right? The things that Michelle and I have been talking about, they're not problems that most often can be solved by a badge or a gun. So why is it that that's who we're choosing to send? I think in a lot of cases, for a lot of cities, that's just a question of convenience. They're the most convenient folks to send, and so that's why we send them. And so it may be the case that some of these officers have incredibly good de-escalation skills, or are trained in crisis intervention, or could be wonderful, wonderful responders. I think that's definitely the case in many situations. But you're also talking about folks whose core training is about law enforcement. And that's a different tool than the ones that we see community responders being able to leverage. And so I know originally your question was, how should we be responding to these different types of crises? And I think my answer would be in different ways, right? In the ways that people actually need. And I think when we start to look around at our cities and look at some of the challenges that do feel urgent and do feel emergent that need to be resolved, what does it actually look like to send the types of people who have the types of skills necessary and are really focused in on those skills, and that's their main skill that they're bringing, rather than that skill in addition to the lawful ability to use force, or the lawful ability to take freedom. What does it look like to really lean into that other set of skills? And I think that that's what community response teams across the country are relying on, are experimenting with, and I think it's really, really cool, honestly.
Yeah, and if I could just add that idea of, it is so much easier to train a community responder in situational awareness and safety than it is to train an officer in a whole new discipline.
I kind of want to dig into that. Like, can we just dig into that? Because look, at the end of the day, that's going to be one of the first questions that people have here. Well, is it safe? Right? The reason, maybe some people were hearing what I was just saying, and they were saying, well, the other reason why we send officers is because these are unsafe situations, and we need somebody who's got the ability to use force and has got the ability to bring a gun into a situation. Right? That's one of the things that is a fear that people have, and it's one that I understand, because we have more guns than people in the United States, and so people, I think, are always afraid, like, there's going to be a gun, there's going to be a situation that these kindly social workers aren't going to be able to deal with, and somebody's going to get killed. And that's what folks said to us back in, I'm sure they've said it to folks in CAHOOTS for decades. I know that as new programs were launching in 2020, that's what we were hearing all the time. You guys are going to get somebody killed out here. And that hasn't happened. It's been 5 years, right? We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of calls taken across the country, more than 100,000 just in Albuquerque, right? And no one's died yet. And I think that tells you a few things. One is what Michelle just said. There are actually ways to keep yourself safe that don't just have to rely on the ability to use force. I think that folks have been really, really smart about not kind of overstretching their limits, right? About kind of growing carefully and like understanding, how do we do this in a way that's safe? But I think it's also a real testament to the skills of responders who are out there that do know how to de-escalate situations, that do know how to bring down the temperature, and can do so in a way that maybe even the best law enforcement officer couldn't do, just by virtue of the gun, the handcuffs, the uniform, the lights, the sirens, this cloak of state authority to use force and to use coercion that I think inherently escalates situations sometimes in ways that, your friendly neighborhood community responder wearing a lime green polo doesn't necessarily do.
I would completely agree. I would add to not just the skill set of community responders, but it's the rapport. The fact that we're there to empower, that we're there power with and not power over, it changes the whole environment. If you just look at a situation just by virtue of the skill set, the focus, the mission, and the tools, like, I don't go into a situation with a feeling, with the foundational feeling that this person wants to hurt me. And they are not going into that situation with the foundational feeling of this responder can and wants to hurt me. And so, like you said, even with the best intentions, the best, empathetic law enforcement officer in a situation, they're trained to think, how can this go wrong? Like you said, the hypotheticals, like if people say, well, what if? Okay, well, CAHOOTS has been in existence for 36 years. We have had just a few injuries and no deaths. So it let the evidence speak for itself if you want to know whether or not it's safe or not safe to do something. But I would say that it is the rapport, it is the trust that we had with our community, and that we trusted them, they trusted us, and it just changed the entire environment. And that's a huge key, is like, I'm non-coercive. I'm not going to take your rights away. That's not my goal. We're going to have safety, but safety looks very different from a community responder lens and from a community member meeting with a community responder than it does from a law enforcement lens.
I'm curious to hear, like, how would you change the assessment that happens from like the dispatcher to knowing who is the team that has to go out there? And second, like, I'm also curious about how many people go out to a response.
I can speak to the CAHOOTS model, the way that built up from the community. So that's one of the things that's unique about having, several decades behind that team, is we organically grew from, like Eli mentioned about the Bummer Squad, right? We organically grew from what the community needed. We didn't get a policy and procedure and go from there. We kind of learned how to do our work based in what the community was teaching us and what they were asking for and what they needed. So some of the pieces that we feel are really important is our team in particular is integrated. So we're integrative health. We understand you can't separate out the mental health, the physical health, the social needs. Like, you're a whole person. And so your crisis and your environment's going to be a whole pie. And so our worker groups includes a mental health provider, a crisis worker with, credentials that match appropriate credentials, within the system, and also a lot of experience and training in how to provide this service in a way that's not, you're not going to read in a book. You learn it from your elders and the people who have come before. And we also have a physical health provider. So we have an EMT or a nurse, because we recognize that those two things together are going to provide the safety net of any kind of crisis. We're going to be able to have eyes on all of the systems that might be affecting that person. And we always go in teams of two. We go in teams of two because it's safer. It's safer for not only the responders, but it's safer for the community. Like, we want to respect the fact that a lot of times we're going into people's homes, that, there may be, elements of a responder that are triggering, or there's just, when you have two people, you have the ability to really pivot with the community member to like make sure that their safety, their comfort, what they are needing from somebody has a match. And so bringing those, the two people, we're non-coercive. We do not do any sort of involuntary holds. We can call in resources if somebody is a danger to themselves or others. Like, that's part of our assessment is, like you were saying, we get in the van, we get the call through 911 dispatch. We're dispatched through the police department, which is really important, kind of going back to what Tahir's point was earlier. People call 911 or non-emergency police when they're like, I don't know what to do with this situation, help me. Right. And so it's really important. And one of the pieces of community responder teams versus some of the newer Medicaid funded behavioral health only teams, for us to be within the public safety system, to be embedded in the system that people are going to call. Because like you mentioned, when dispatch gets something and they have to triage, like, who's the most appropriate responder for this call? Historically, it was police, fire, EMS. Those were your three options. Pick one. And there's all these policies and procedures that come with, public safety and government liability, all that kind of stuff. When you started to roll in, like, the idea of, community responders, for example, like Eugene, most of the dispatchers that are on, in communication, they've always known CAHOOTS. The officers who are on the street, they've always known a CAHOOTS, like, they've always known a community responder. And so they were trained to know that there was this other option where if it wasn't like a criminal violent thing that needed a punitive law enforcement response, it wasn't a life or limb threatening emergency, or it wasn't on fire, it was most likely something that was like a community responder call. And so that gets triaged through that system. I think we do, have a lot of room to evolve that system to help, you know, because dispatchers too, me being somebody who had been a dispatcher in a large city for 8 years, hypothetical is how you go. How can this go wrong? You know, that's the first question rather than who's the right provider. You know, we need to kind of shift over from that kind of, you know, what if scenario to, you know, what if I send the right person and it goes right type thing. But yeah, as responders, we're assessing, like, you know, with our system, we're looking to see if we've had contact before. We're looking to like make sure that, you know, there's not any safety issues for them or us in reference to that call. And we're actually pretty neutral and open to whatever it's going to be, you know, so the assessment doesn't happen until you get there. You're sitting with somebody and you're like, how can I help?
Yeah, and I think that one thing that has been really interesting as we've started to see these different experimental programs pop up across the country is that the sort of background of the person responding is different in different places, right? So there are some places where they're sending out a lot of folks with deep clinical experience, right? Folks who are licensed social workers, right? You know, and have gone through, you know, a really, really sort of health-oriented graduate program. Some places are using those folks alongside peers. Some folks are using peer-only programs for community response, sort of with the sort of thinking that in a lot of these situations, what's kind of urgent or emergent about it doesn't necessarily require like a diagnosis on the scene, right? In the same way that when somebody is coming to respond to a medical call for help, you know, ambulance shows up, you don't have the cardiac surgeon showing up. You have a paramedic or an EMT, somebody whose goal is to stabilize the situation, right? Not necessarily to resolve it in the sort of long term. And so, and I think that's an important development because, gosh, I remember in 2020, people starting to have conversations and saying, hey, you know, why aren't we sending out social workers instead of police to these calls? And I was like, yeah, that's a good idea. That's a really, really good idea. We started looking around and it's like, wait, we don't have enough social workers for that, right? We have nowhere near enough social workers for that. And a lot of people who sign up to be social workers, it's not actually precisely what they signed up to do. They might have signed up to, you know, be a therapist, right? A talk therapist or something like that. They didn't necessarily sign up to, you know, go respond to a call underneath a bridge while it's raining at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Friday, right? So I think that what a lot of cities are figuring out is how can we make sure that folks have the skills that they need for these calls, but not necessarily create a requirement that people need more skills to get the job than they actually need to perform the job well. And so we're seeing lots of different places kind of experiment with what that looks like. And, you know, I think a lot of folks are coming to the conclusion that licensed clinicians are an important part of the system and an important part of the response, the overall response team, but might not necessarily be the people that need to respond to every single call.
I wanted to pivot back to the existing systems of response and the problems that they've created. So we can kind of put this in context. We've been talking about crisis response programs, how they operate a little bit and the thinking behind them. But it's also important to kind of recognize there's still a very small part of the system available to people across the country. And so what we mostly have is what you all have described as a 911 system that really can only send police, fire, and medical. And so can you speak to a little bit about what problems that's created and who's hit hardest and how that ripples out in communities? Why is this community crisis response program such an important solution to advance?
we're having to change an entire framework that was created generationally. You know, this idea that if you need somebody 24/7, you call 911, and then the system is okay. Historically, we send these three types of provider, and as other social safety nets have fallen apart, more and more are having to call the government system for help because there's, you know, not the help in the community. There's not the help, you know, with any, you know, local providers. There's not, you know, even a lot of the local crisis lines or the local support systems that might be in your community center or your library or the school. Like if you look at just the things that are removed from schools that might have been there a generation ago, there's only one pathway to getting support, and that's through 911, and it's doing what it was created to do, and now having to kind of field this larger social issues and try to figure out what bucket do I put this kind of call in. And everyone is being harmed by that, because often, if you look, or in my experience, what I found is, even these crossover type crises that, with substance use or maybe, wound care in the unhoused population or a conflict or something like that, where, you're thinking, okay, EMS, they need to have some sort of medical assessment, or is this a medical problem? It's not a crime. So maybe it's a medical problem. And a lot of our EMS fire systems are completely understaffed and overwhelmed and under-resourced because they're mainly, trying to figure out how to fund more services through, insurance-based stuff, which is a difference with police. Police never have to figure out how to fund any of their components by insurance. That's a system. They don't have to figure out a diagnosis. That could be really interesting, I think, actually, if like all of a sudden, crimes had to have a diagnosis, and they're, that could be a fun reality show to kind of figure out what do I do with this. But EMS is, saying this is not our pot. There's no diagnosis for it, and therefore it gets kicked back to the only thing left. And, the only thing left is law enforcement, because they don't have the restrictive, they go on everything that's left if there's no other situation. And so community members aren't getting what they need, obviously. They're most likely not calling because they would like a police officer to come and solve their problem for them. And also just the people who are working within, the law enforcement system too are, feeling inadequately prepared and thinking that there's got to be something, something better than this. And I think that's where we're all just kind of sitting now, is there's got to be something better than this. But this is the way we've always done it. And it's really hard to envision it different, especially if you're kind of taking it from who has always done this instead of saying who should do this. And that always, to me, seems to get us stuck in like, a lot of the agencies across the nation who are trying to figure out how to have a community responder team. And they're like, okay, well, what calls is law enforcement willing to give them? As if it's like, can we have a little bit of your candy from your bucket? It really should be, what are the calls that are coming in and who should they go to? But that's just a very different top-down look than what's left and where should it go. And so it's requiring a completely different mindset that is very different in a social system that has lost so much support. And, we need to support people. Like, it's just going to keep getting worse. This isn't something where if we just ignore it or we refuse, we just say, okay, status quo, people will stop calling. The crisis is going to have to go somewhere. And so we have to address it.
To hear, and I'm curious to hear from you, what is it about this current approach that is causing more that is failing to provide a solution?
It's just doing the wrong thing, right? Gosh, if somebody had a heart attack and we sent police to the scene, everybody would be like, what are you doing? Why would you do that? And we we think of mental health differently. We think of behavioral health problems differently. We shouldn't. For the first, that's actually the entire origins of disability law and disability discrimination, and that's actually why in a lot of places there are actually lawsuits saying, "Hey, if I break my arm, you will send the right response. But if I'm in the midst of a mental health crisis, you're going to send, um, not a health oriented response. You're going to send a law enforcement oriented response that actually constitutes disability discrimination." I think they've got a good point and a good case on that front. um, but when I ask that question about, if you break your arm or if you have a heart attack, who are we going to send? It's actually really funny that we all kind of laugh at that, because 60 years ago it was the case that maybe you would actually get a police officer. People actually don't realize that paramedicine, EMTs, this is actually a relatively new innovation, right? So this is 1966. The National Academy of Sciences publishes a paper on oh gosh, what is it? It's accidental death and disability, the neglected disease of modern society, which basically flags that there's people all over the country who are dying because we don't have mobile medical care for folks. We can't actually send the right people out when you have an emergency. And over the course of the next 20 years, this entire system that we kind of take for granted now of ambulances dispatched at 911 in every community in the country, where you feel like if you've got a medical emergency, you're going to be able to call 911 and get an ambulance to show up in minutes. This is all an innovation of the last 60 years. And so it's kind of comical to think that, we did it differently before that. And I think that 60 years from now, they will look back and think about what we are doing now in the same sort of way. Wait, you said who? To that kind of a call? Why? What were you thinking? Why did you send the folks who actually could help with the situation? And so, and I think they will think that because the downstream effects really are tragic. When you look at not only the ways in which a lot of the folks who need care instead get drawn into the criminal legal system, and that sort of really vicious cycle of criminal legal system involvement. Now you've got a court date. Maybe you've spent some time in jail. Maybe now you've lost your job. Any stability that you did have is now going away. Is that going to be great for your mental health or your behavioral health? It's not going to be great. Now you're kind of into this sort of vicious cycle of the criminal legal system, and that's in some cases the best case scenario, right? A quarter of the people who are killed by law enforcement in this country each year are in the midst of a mental health crisis. And I think honestly that's a rather conservative number. That's where we've got a verified mental health crisis. I think in a lot of other situations you're talking, I think that number is actually likely much, much higher. And so it's a real tragedy to be dealing with folks who are in crisis, who need help, and we are sending just not the right tool, right? We're trying to use, a jackhammer instead of a screwdriver, and then we're wondering why it doesn't work.
I want to ask a question about how police departments have responded to this work, because I've heard police officers, say things like, I signed up to, solve crimes. I didn't sign up to respond to somebody who's sleeping on the street. And so it seems like there's sort of like a win-win there, where they can, police can kind of stay in their lane, and community crisis response programs can meet all of these other needs that aren't being met. At the same time, city budgets are finite, and there are political battles over who gets what funds. And I know a lot of these crisis response programs around the country have been funded with ARPA and other temporary funding sources, and are really kind of vulnerable to losing their funding. And so I'm curious how you all see that collaboration and the kind of politics around these programs.
It's incredibly complex. That's what we're learning in our community, where CAHOOTS, the contract with the city of Eugene and Whitebird Clinic's CAHOOTS program was canceled in April for a variety of reasons. But at its heart, a lot of it was political, and a lot of it was funding, type. Everybody's in a funding crunch, and, everyone's kind of, the general funds, which, the CAHOOTS program was funded through, was, at its max of being able to, support, and a lot of really hard cuts are having to be made. And so one of the things that I experienced in, kind of learning through this process is, when you have a scarcity mindset, when you have, funding that's based in a scarcity mindset, you're always going to end up with silos if you are not able to look at relationship. It's like everyone's fighting. It's the same thing within the nonprofit world, where it's like we're finding that our peer, service, our peer organizations, and our substance use organizations, and our housing organizations, and our community responder organizations, we're all fighting for the same money. And it's just creating this really, unhealthy, uncomfortable environment where it's really, we're all struggling to figure out, how do we work together? How can we be vulnerable together in a situation in which it feels like, to protect yourself, you have to think about what's best for your organization. I think in our area, we're definitely beginning to get back to what's best for the community, what's best for our clients. And then we need to band together to say, this is what we're needing from our government. This is what we're needing from the general fund. This is what we're needing as far as funding. And I think, unfortunately, the police department is in that same kind of boat, where, they're protecting their assets, they're protecting their space within, the budgetary confines. And that's creating some real problem, because, we all know law enforcement, their unions are incredibly powerful. They're very embedded in, their goal is to keep officers working. And so when you look at this idea, just in the simplicity of, who's the right responder for the right call at the right time, and you look at the numbers of violent criminal calls, ending up being only about 1% of what law enforcement is responding to, the community starts to say, wait, well, what about the other? Why are we funding this expensive punitive system for the other 99%? And, to stay relevant, the leadership and unions and, people who are protecting that environment, they're, going to find ways to make them the most appropriate. And usually it's the what if, it's the safety. Well, it's a safety issue. Everything's a safety issue. And I think that a large part of the community responder environment being created after 2020, unfortunately, and we saw a lot of this in our community, is we were pitted as anti-police. We were, even the term alternatives to policing give a sense of anti, we're opposition, where, we want to erase you, we want to replace you. And we see the harm in those systems and want to make sure that police don't need to be where they're not needed. That's very different than, we're adversarial to you as a person or you as a identity. And I think that creates a lot of the political and funding issues is, this idea of defund the police. And I really liked a meme I had heard, which was like, well, saying let's go ahead and reallocate money to the correct providers so we could build up a better safety net and serve people where they needed to be served is not easy to write on a banner or a billboard. And so really it's like, unfortunately, within the framework of being able to actually call out power and call out the harms, it became an us them. And I think what we've learned over the years is us them against, a thin blue line is actually a really hard place to be.
I just want to underline that. I think Michelle is exactly right that, police are extraordinarily expensive, right? Not, their training, their equipment, their salaries are good, but I don't think unfair. And I don't think that we should be trying to save money by paying community responders less than we're paying police. And I don't think that we should be skimping on training or anything like that. But even if you just think about like the liability insurance and the lawsuits and what those payouts look like, I mean, just extraordinary dollars that are going out the door of cities. And so I think that smart cities are going to look and see what are the ways in which I can reduce that sort of liability, right? Like, would we rather, instead of paying out 7-figure settlements to people who have experienced harm at the hands of police, why don't we try to send folks out the door who are less likely to do that harm in the first place? I think all of those people who have received those settlements, every one of them would pay it back to not have that harm experienced in the first place. And instead of those dollars going out of the door, to a single family to try to make amends for, a devastating experience, what if we invested those dollars in something that could, be generative, right? In the first place, right? Be literally helping the community. And so I think that smart cities are starting to sort of recognize that calculus and seeing that investing in this is a smart way of investing. But we are stuck right now, still in a political environment, in a media environment where, folks will cut social services, will cut investments in the community, and the very last thing that they will touch is, is police and prisons and jails, right? And I think that tends to be short-sighted, not because, I think that, the answer to everything is cutting policing funding, but I think that when you cut those other kinds of programs, you actually put more and more burden on police. And that's what we see across the country, right? Just despite the enormous amounts of money that we spend on police, there isn't a single big city department in the country that doesn't feel that they are underfunded and understaffed. And it is because you got to pay the piper somewhere. And all of these other things that we're throwing at police, yeah, it is too much. It is too much for them, right? It's too much for the police to, be dealing with our failures to invest in our mental health system, our failures to invest in proper education and in after school programs and in, proper housing. We can't throw the police a few extra bones and then say, all right, great, fix all these problems that we never invested in. But that's what cities across the country are doing.
I think we've done a really good job so far at sort of talking a little bit about community crisis response programs, kind of what they do. I think that the ideas in there, we've talked a little bit about the values, and there's a couple of propositions that you brought up to here in this last statement. So I'm wondering if we could start moving towards the last couple of questions, which is looking like at what does it look like to organize to make this policy into reality? But like you mentioned, there's so many different components of that. So if we could choose one of those different components that could become a policy, and then we can move into like what are the other policies and programs that are needed to complement it. I feel like that will get us to now the organizing of a solution part, and then we'll ask the last little big questions. Does that feel good, like a good strategy, Eli? So okay, cool. Okay, so now let me go back to the cut. So throughout the episode, we've had, I think, a really good conversation. And thank you both again for sharing some of the underlying values that have informed the current response to crises. And I'm just saying that in a blanketed way, right? We've talked about different options, different solutions. It's not going to look the same depending on the crises, depending on the community. See, that's what in social work we call person and environment perspective, which we should do more in urban planning, but I digress. I'm curious if we could start talking a little bit about, in the conversation you've mentioned a couple of things that could be changed, a couple of solutions to, or, you know, not like a blanketed solution, right? Because we know it's a very big problem, but maybe changing either responding, assessment, changing training for community responders. So I'm curious if we could start talking about what are those solutions, and what do you think it would look like, the organizing would look like to make that into a reality?
There's a couple of things that I would start with. The first is that city councils, county commissions across the country, they need to hear from folks that this is the path forward, right? You know, I was just sort of lamenting that at the end of the day, you know, the very last thing that, you know, a city council is ever going to touch is the public safety budget. You know, but that comes for a reason, right? Because people will call them, people will show up, people will vote folks out of office because they feel like they're not taking crime seriously, right? And so, you know, politicians need to be afraid that if they don't do X or Y or Z thing, then they're going to be held accountable for it. And I think the reality is that where folks haven't had the opportunity to see how exciting this development is, and as you know, unfortunately, CAHOOTS shows, even in some places where folks have had that opportunity, if we don't hold politicians' feet to the fire and say, "Hey, this is what I'm holding you accountable to," and if you don't, if this is not something that you're going to be willing to invest in, then you know you should expect to pack your bags. That has to be the sort of energy that folks are bringing, because if you don't, the thing that they are pushing back against, you know, sort of elsewhere, you know, whether it's from police unions or just from normie folks who, you know, don't necessarily know that stuff like CAHOOTS and Albuquerque Community Safety and Durham Heart, they don't necessarily know that those things are out there, and they're not necessarily going to hold folks account for that. So I just think for anybody sort of hearing this, you know, if you're wondering, hey, why don't I have something like this in my city? You know, yeah, I'm looking at you right now. I'm looking directly at you and saying, hey, I need you to pick up the phone. I need you to call your city council and say, hey, why don't we have something like CAHOOTS? Why don't we have something like Albuquerque Community Safety? So I think that's the most important thing. I think that the other thing that I would say is, um, you know, we need to do a better job of investing in our full social safety net, and I think policymakers need to realize that. Um, you know, so one thing that a lot of folks who study crime, right, and criminologists sort of lament is the way that um, no matter how low the crime rate gets, people always think the crime rate's going up, right? Public opinion polling over the last few decades has shown that, like, as crime maybe spikes at some periods of time, but since the 90s, crime is that, most criminologists would call the decline in crime since the 90s literally miraculous, right? And but over the course of that same period, people think that the rate has just gone up and up and up and up. And some of that is because people associate things that are not criminal, but things like, public intoxication or public substance use, or even, being poor in public, right? People sleeping on stoops and people, in homeless encampments. They associate those things with crime. And they will punish politicians for not driving down the crime rate, even if the crime rate is falling, because they have not solved for the people who have fallen through the rest of our social safety net. And that's the thing that I want politicians to know in their heart of hearts. All of the money that you are throwing at police and at prisons and at jails because you were like, hey, I need to drive down the crime rate. You won't get a reward for that. You're going to continue to get hit politically on it because people are actually holding you accountable to things that don't show up in the crime rate. They're actually holding you accountable to not solving for these other pieces of our social safety net. And so I think that this sort of alternative response, community response, plus deeper investments in our housing, our substance use, our mental health sort of safety nets, I think that that's actually the secret sauce for how politicians need to move in order to see those declines in crime start to actually show up in public opinion.
People equate, like, human behavior. When you think about human behavior, they equate I am uncomfortable with I am unsafe. And then when they say I am unsafe, that means a crime is happening, right? And then the police are absolutely an appropriate resource for, solving whatever that is. And I think people are continue to be very uncomfortable with how our failing social safety nets are ending up in their spaces, in their communities, and we're talking about it too. Like, that's taboo. Now we're talking about it. And I think that, going back to what Tahir said about, city council and county governments, and that is what, we have found as an incredible piece of us trying to build, a CAHOOTS-like service back into the city of Eugene in our area with, our new organization, which is founded and the worker groups are, former CAHOOTians, because we want to see this service continue in the city of Eugene. Our main narrative was to get in front of the city council and also get our community members in front of the city council. And the big piece of it is talking about what is community safety, right? We've had this idea that community safety means public safety, which means, a man with a gun. Those are the things that, when we look at what we were taught, maybe growing up, what the community what we inherently, that's our bias, like our unintended, our inherent bias is that safety means that. And so when you start challenging that narrative, but challenging it in a way where it's like, we're here as a community, city council is part of the community, the police are part of the community, patrol, like you mentioned earlier, they're like, we don't want to do this. We're not geared for this. I mean, I don't know how many times in the back of my mind, I could just see the look on an officer's face, which basically is telling me this person is crying. Would you please take it? Like this, I don't know how to, you can't handcuff arrest or, do something with crying. I need help here. But just really insisting that your community and the people who are writing policy define what community safety looks like. And once you really start digging into what community safety looks like, you can have funding that reflects community safety, and you start having these, upstream solutions to, the problems that, looked like they were criminal in the beginning. And the other thing is looking at the social safety net as it continues to decline, it is making community response that much more important. As we are watching like potential cuts to Medicaid, potential cuts to special education, cuts to, all of, these programs that have been supporting and allowing people to move forward from states of crisis. Because again, it's just you've reached your capacity to cope. If you don't have these other supports, it's going to push you closer to that capacity and you're going to need community responders more. So like, we're going to need that safety net of people who can manage crisis and also hold the systems accountable. Like being able to like show up on, on those task force, go up and, show up at the tables with law enforcement and other providers and, the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, like all of these spaces and say, this is what we're seeing in the streets. This is what people are needing. These are like, we need bigger things, I need solutions, not Band-Aids, type of stuff. But this is what we're seeing. And we can speak to that in places where those we are serving are not invited to be. So when they're creating solutions at these tables in back rooms of these large organizations, our public safety organizations, our healthcare organizations, our county organizations, our state organizations, our clients are not able to, they're not invited to those rooms. And so when you have community responders who are also part of that, we're able to say, hey, this is what we're seeing. This is what what are actually going to help solve some issues. And we can, really move forward positively with our clients in mind. Systems should be designed to serve clients, not clients serve to design systems.
I'm holding on to the potential hope that I think as you're talking about the decline of social systems, that we are going to find alternative approaches to crisis response. Because to what exactly you said, I think in times of emergencies, you really start to see people come out in action. I'm just like looking at the ways in which community have responded against ICE raids. That is a crisis response program. It's not necessarily so much formalized, it's not institutionalized, but at least in terms of the emergency, like I think sometimes I have to remind myself that we are not defined by institutions. As a species, as a human thing, we are defined by social relationships. And when you see ourselves in terms of emergencies, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's the kidnapping of folks, you see people come out and the values and identity politics are thrown out the window, and we respond in a very visceral, biological way that it's like, that is the hope in my mind of an echo of a possibility that we haven't yet imagined, but it's so internal to who we are as people. We saw that during COVID, and in a pandemic that's continuously happening. So thank you. I'm sorry. I don't know why I went there, but I was like, yes, it's possible.
Well, I just wanted to ask, for those folks who want to learn more, who want to get involved, who want to advocate for community crisis response programs, where would you point them for organizations or resources for learning and action?
I would do a couple that selfishly I'm affiliated with both. So obviously I'm the executive director at Georgetown Law's Center for Innovations in Community Safety. I would certainly link up. With us. I would also look at the Alternative Mobile Services Association, where I'm a board member. That is an organization that is really dedicated to advancing the interests of alternative response practitioners across the country and the field more broadly as well. But I always think it's important that folks be involved in local organizing within their communities, and that it's not that folks need to necessarily just be plugged into sort of national groups or organizations like ours, but really plugged into sort of local organizing and bring these ideas and these concepts into those spaces, right? That's a place where we don't want to be helpful for anybody who is trying to get this off the ground or this growing or expanded within their within their cities.
Yeah, I would agree. One of the really cool things that I've been able to be involved in is being on the technical advisory council to Alliance for Safety and Justice's Scaling Safety Project. So we are bringing resources and technical assistance and, just all of the, kind of subject matter expertise and stuff like that to 5 identified cities. And the cool thing being part of the mental health crisis response piece is we get to participate and go to cities and look at what's already on the ground and say, how can we help support you to build up what you want? And so we're really hopeful that, that we'll be able to expand this kind of opportunity. To be able to do technical advisory to cities, in whatever scalable fashion that they're needing, whether it's just like, can we talk about, our law enforcement and our fire, services and stuff really want to talk about what this would look like to have a community response program. And I think being able to speak the language and also, having people, especially in our organization, Willamette Valley Crisis Care, who, can bridge these, we call ourselves translators. Like we're able to take the language of law enforcement, the language of behavioral health, the language of fire EMS, and translate it to the other things. So when we do have these conversations, Tahir mentioned earlier, it's always about, well, how are we going to keep you safe? And, I kind of push back and I'm like, well, how can we help you do your jobs better? Right. And what we have found is, once officers see how community responders work, because they are, skilled, they are subject matter experts, they are parts of the community. They're able to build these relationships very quickly with, people who are, needing support, again, by giving that power back to them, by empowering them. People resonate really quickly with the recognition that they are the leaders in their own lives. And you're like, I'm here to help you. And I don't have a solution. I don't have a fix, which, law enforcement has to, that's part of their mission, their focus, and their tools. I come, you give me as much information as I need so I can quickly create a solution that will stabilize what is going on right now. Where we go in and it's like, I'm here to figure out, what is important to you right now? Because it may not be what you think it is. It may not be, oh, well, obviously they need to be housed, or obviously they're struggling, need to be back on medication because their psychotic break is what's the problem. What I have found in, 27 years of doing this work is often what I think the problem is not the problem that they want to look at. It's not the solution they're looking for in that moment to ease the crisis that they're having. And so, once you almost see this look come over officers when they're first experiencing it. It's like, I'm not really sure what's going on here, but there's this magical thing that's happening. And really what it is, it's, how people feel when they're heard, understood, and accepted. That's what people are sensing. And that's just magical, going back to what's human behavior, what is we're relational creatures. We're wired to connect. What we're bringing is connection. It's not rocket science.
You mentioned something earlier to hear about folks who go into social work. I'm like, some people also go into social work looking for therapy, and it's like, girl, wrong place. Hold on. I think a lot of the times my biggest frustration right now in talking about, particularly in the realm of social media, I think to your point, Michelle, it is about there's a magic in terms of hearing people's stories, also because we take on the responsibility to hold on to the trauma in some ways. I think we have our mechanisms of processing it, and we have our mechanisms of going through it. But I think truly the magical spark is the commitment to show up. In social work practice, we say that showing up is half the battle. And so that's the easiest part of it all, I think, for sure. So what an honor to be in conversation with you both today.
What's a key takeaway that y'all would like people to remember from this conversation today? If there's one thing you want to just lift up as we close.
Yeah, I think for me, it's that solutions need to be community-based, and they need to be about empowerment and non-coercive relationship. And so policy really should be guided from the field up. That's where the solutions are. When we try to create policy from the top down, often we end up having to fix it. And in that fix, people end up suffering while we're trying to like actually make it match what in practice we actually need to be doing. And so, community responders are experts because we were trained by the community. And I just think we need to remember that, we often, just we hold space for people so they don't suffer alone. And then we can move towards solutions. But often when you look at credentialing, policies, legislature, liability, and, you say, what is how do we regulate what, somebody's sitting with someone so they're not alone? It ends up getting really confusing. So it really needs to be community-based, and it needs to be led from the field workers up.
When you do this, could you just edit so that my idea goes before Michelle's, because I don't want to really follow that, because that feels like the mic drop moment, honestly. But yeah, I would just say, this isn't utopia that we're reaching for. This is happening. It's happening in cities across the country, and I think it's quite obviously the future. And the thing I guess that I would want folks to take away is that this should be the base expectation for what cities are doing. This is should occupy the same space as, can you send out an ambulance if somebody's having a heart attack, right? And if the city couldn't do that, we'd be in uproar. We'd be like, what? Oh my gosh, what are you kidding? And I think that this has got to feel the same sort of way.
Can you talk a little bit about what research or evidence you're aware of that supports community crisis response programs and their development?
There have been research studies done kind of across the nation over the course of the last few years, and some of them are actually starting to report out findings now, because a lot of these research studies are really long. They're 3, 4, 5 year studies. I saw one just yesterday that was actually on co-response. This is a model where actually you have a police officer showing up with a clinician or a social worker, and it was showing that for those responses, which I think can be appropriate for certain situations where maybe there is, maybe somebody does have a gun or is waving around a knife, or something that where a community response might not feel necessarily appropriate in the moment, and it was showing that there are fewer arrests, and that there is less criminal justice system contact that comes out of those calls than similar police only calls. I think that we're starting to see the same sorts of evidence show up elsewhere. I think Michelle noted, right, some of the things that some of the major outcomes here are actually really, really basic ones. Like, can we send these people and nobody gets arrested? Can we send these people and nobody gets hurt? We don't actually need studies for that, right? We actually can just look at the data on the ground, and we can look at the rates of injuries, which are extremely, extremely low. Quite obviously, the arrest rates are zero because they don't have the power to arrest. So that alone is, I think, a good thing, decreasing the sort of harms that are associated with arrests. So there's going to be more studies that come out later, and I think that they are helpful. I think that studies are great. I'm obviously at an academic institution. I wouldn't say that people shouldn't be doing studies, but I also just want to emphasize one thing with regards to studies, right? The police never did a randomized control trial before they started doing mass incarceration, right? We didn't do a randomized control trial before we started taking people who were experiencing mental health crises to jail. And I don't think that we need one to stop it necessarily. And so, I think it is great to look for research, but I also don't think that we should wait on it, because I think that there are things that we can see with our own eyes, that, and that's something that we can trust.
Yeah, and I just, want to speak to, we've actually been really lucky and blessed to be working with some really amazing researchers at the University of Oregon over the last couple of years who are putting out some papers that are showing that, some of the outcomes of having a CAHOOTS-like response, there's something called the halo effect, which they're actually finding that if CAHOOTS went out to an area to respond to something, there was actually less calls for service in that area for a specific period of time. So that was something that was really surprising that came out of the study. And then one of the other things is we have a sociologist who is talking to our population of people who are current or were formerly unhoused and are now housed. And what they're consistently reporting is that having a community responder contact or having CAHOOTS come out and support them prior actually got them into a stable situation more quickly. And, looking back on the situation, I have no doubt that it was, number one, we're very well versed in what our community has available and what might be the most appropriate for this person in their particular situation, whether, they've got, co-occurring substance use, if there's children, if there's, all of these different situations. Like, we're really familiar with our community resources and how to connect. And also we empower people to do that. Plus we offer transportation. That's one of the things that a lot of other, like the mobile crisis units don't offer. And it's like, if you can say, everyone always talks about how warm handoffs always have better outcomes. And it's like, if you can say, sit with somebody, dig in with, good rapport building and find out what it is that's going to help them, make them feel empowered enough to like do that next step and then take them to the next step. Kind of like Tahir said, you're not going to need research to show that that's probably going to have better outcomes than handing them a piece of paper or, not having anyone really familiar with the situation, helping them try to navigate really difficult, systems. So yeah, sometimes I'm really excited about the research that's coming out on, how CAHOOTS is really helping to decrease some of the social service needs and decrease the need for police to even have to respond to situations after a community responder has gone out.
Well, thank you all so much for listening to this episode. Very important to have alternatives to police's responses. And if you like this episode, make sure you continue to listen, subscribe, and comment on all of our episodes at the Real Solution Podcast.